When John Tyler became president after the death of William Henry Harrison, he was a Democrat in every way, shape, or form, except he disagreed on Jackson's handling of the tariff controversy with South Carolina. But all his beliefs were Southern Democratic. And so he opposed his own party. He fought with the Whig Party so much that the Whig Party kicked him out. So he was a president without a party. So because of that, Whigs had kicked him out. Democrats wouldn't accept him because he turned against Jackson, and you do not turn against Jackson and get accepted into the Democratic Party. He dominated the party. So he will get nothing done in terms of domestic policy. That's why his entire administration will be geared towards foreign policy. And in terms of foreign policy, he will have two areas that he focuses on. First, and of much less important, was settling boundary disputes with England. The United States and England have been getting along very well since the War of 1812, except a few border disputes, including in Maine and Minnesota. And the disputes in Maine and Minnesota were very quickly worked out. It's called the Webster-Ashburn Treaty for Lord Ashburn and Daniel Webster, the Secretary of State. And it turned out incredibly favorably for the United States. Remember, God looks out for fools, drunks in the United States of America. And it turns out the area in Minnesota that the United States got had one of the richest iron ores in the world. But he got that out of the way very quickly because he wasn't actually interested in dealing with those areas. He wanted to get him out of the way because what he was really interested in was Texas. Little background for what was happening in Texas when he came, what had happened in Texas up to the point when he came into office. So I will keep this as brief as possible, and it's probably a review for a lot of people in Texas. But when Spain owned Mexico, Spain did virtually nothing to take care of the area called Texas. So it was controlled overwhelmingly by Native Americans, specifically the Comanche and the Apache. Comanche especially, they were very vicious fighters. In 1821, Mexico declares independence from Spain. And at that time, there were about 3,000 people of European descent living in the area we call Texas. Now, after Mexico gained independence from Spain, the Mexican government will make a point of trying to settle the area called Texas. And they have a problem because people from Mexico don't want to go up there because it was just dangerous. There's a lot of you're basically, wherever you live in a few tiny cities, you're living in a sea of Native Americans and some very, very great fighting. Comanches were vicious. So it was just a very dangerous place to live. So people of Spanish descent, people in Mexico, they didn't want to go up there. Ironically enough, what the Mexican government was actually worried about, though, was the fact that so many Americans wanted to go there. And the reason Americans wanted to go there was because it is prime cotton land. The cotton belt, there's only a certain part of the country where you can grow cotton, and Texas had a huge part of it. So this sounds incredibly dumb, and it is kind of dumb. But the Mexican government will decide, in order to protect that area from the Anglo-Americans, they were going to bring Anglo-Americans in legally And the idea was that the new Anglo-Americans, they're called Texians, would become good Mexican citizens. They would convert to Catholicism, they would not be slaveholders because Mexico had abolished slavery, and they would boost the population up enough that there was stability and the people from Mexico would want to come up, offering protection. So they were, this was done through what were called impresarios. So the impresario is a colonizing agent. It is an American that is hired by the Mexican government to bring in families from America legally so they will become Texians, or Anglo-Americans living in Texas under the Mexican government. And again, it sounds dumb to bring in Americans to protect them from the Americans that were coming in, but it was the best of all bad options. The government did not have money, it wasn't stable, and so it could not send up its own military to protect it. Anglo-Americans were already coming in. Ironically, the first illegal immigrants to Texas were Americans. So Americans are already coming in illegally. So the Mexican government figured, we'll just bring them in legally, and they'll be so grateful, they'll be good Mexican citizens. And so beginning in 1821, the number of Americans that come in just is enormous. Americans come in huge numbers because at this time you could get 4,000 acres of land in Texas for what it costs to get 100 acres in the United States. And so Americans will flood in huge numbers in order to get this land. And Stephen F. Austin, of course, is the first impresario and the most famous impresario that will bring in a ton of people. And so many people are brought in. By 1835, the area called Texas was essentially an Anglo-American province. It had the Anglo-American population was 30,000. So there are 30,000 Texians, and there was only about 5,000 people of Mexican or Spanish descent. So it is overwhelmingly controlled by Texians or Americans, or not controlled, but they make up the vast majority of the population. Now, there was a problem, and to say something that is very obvious, Americans made absolutely terrible Mexican citizens. They were really terrible Mexican citizens for several reasons. First, they spoke a different language, and they were not willing to learn to speak Spanish. Second, they were required to convert to Roman Catholicism, and of course they didn't do that. Overwhelmingly Baptist, Methodist, some Presbyterians. Now, the government of Mexico didn't really enforce this because at least they had enough tact not to build mega churches, and so they didn't flaunt that they were ignoring this. The bigger issue was slavery. The overwhelming majority of Anglo-Americans that came to Texas came from the southern states and came for the purpose of growing cotton, which required slaves. This was a problem because in 1829, the government of Mexico had officially abolished slavery all throughout its entire country. So slavery was abolished, and this might have been a problem, except Americans are phenomenal at breaking laws, figuring out ways to legally break laws in order to earn more money. It is a gift. And so what they figured out a loophole. They would bring the slaves up to the border of Texas, and then they would free their slaves and then get their slaves to sign a war contract. Indentured servitude was legal. Actually, Stephen F. Austin made sure to slide in a resolution that said Texas would allow indentured servants. So they would free their slaves and then make their slaves sign a work contract for 99 years and guaranteeing their children would serve for 99 years. And obviously, slaves couldn't read and they were just told to sign it, so they did. So this was not technically slavery, it's a work contract, but obviously it was just slavery. And the Mexican government actually knew this was happening for quite a while. So it's not like the Mexican government of Mexico was completely dumb. But it's really important. They could not really do very much to stop this. And there's this incredibly incorrect belief that the Mexican government was just being horribly oppressive to the people of Mexico, and that is actually the opposite was true. The government of Mexico was so unstable and so economically weak that it was ignoring the people there. That was the big complaint of the people in Texas, is you're not providing us help. So the government of Mexico just allowed them to get away with this. And by 1835, when there were 30,000 Texians, 5,000 people of Mexican or Spanish descent, there were about 5,000 slaves. So the slave and Mexican population is equal. And there was about one slave for every 6 Anglos. So the slave population was really big. So slavery was a constant issue. And the fourth issue, the one that was a constant problem, was that the people of Texians, were constantly pushing for more independence from Mexico. It's really important to understand. The government of Mexico had created a federal system. That is what the United States has. Federal government is on the top, and then you have the state governments underneath it. Federal law is the law of the land, and state governments underneath it, but each state has its own constitution and makes their own laws. Well, Texas wasn't its own state. It was part of what is called Coahuila, Texas. And Coahuila was the part that had a lot of a big Mexican population and made all of the laws. So the people in Texas, they weren't even able to make laws about the state constitution of Coahuila, Texas. They could like, you know, make noise and like suggest things, but the number of people in Coahuila, of Mexicans in Coahuila, meant that they didn't have very much power in the government, in the state government. So Texians, or the Americans in Texas, were constantly pushing to become their own state, so they could have more control, so they could make their own laws. And that is something that they would constantly push for, and particularly protecting slavery. Now, this is obviously a no-go for Mexico, because Texas becomes its own state, writes its own state constitution. It is a not very far leap for Texas then just to join the United States. So that was a constant no-go for Mexico. So there were butting of the heads, and this is obviously just a recipe for disaster, and it was a disaster. And it became a disaster for two big reasons. Well, there's a lot more than this. And again, oversimplification. But for one, at some point, the Mexican government realized, oh my gosh, we're losing control of this area. So in 1830, they will close off immigration from the United States. Now, when they did that, again, they don't have the resources to have soldiers like on the border. They don't have the resources to build a wall or something like that. So they said, all right, no more immigration, but Americans kept coming anyway. The second way, more important one, is this guy right here. Now, if you are a Texan, and if you are a good Texan and you know nothing about Texas history at all, you know for some reason the name Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna makes your blood boil and makes you just furious for some odd reason. Santa Anna is the Andrew Jackson of Mexico. He was a war hero. He defeated his country's colonial power, Spain, not England, and he will dominate Mexican politics for an entire generation. So he will dominate a whole chunk of time, just like Andrew Jackson did. And in 1834, he was elected president because he was a war hero. Now, at the time, Mexico was divided, and the political division were between federalists, or people that supported the federal system, we just talked about, and also the Constitution that supported created the federal system. But there were also people that supported the traditional system or the monarchical system. And obviously that is the very rich and very elite. They wanted to get away, undo the federal system, get rid of the Constitution. And obviously, if that happens, what they're calling for is a dictator. Now, the people in Texas, of course, do not want a monarchical system. They do not want to go back to the traditional system under Spain. They want the federal system. And Santa Anna championed the federal system, and he championed the Constitution that supported it, so Americans, or Texians, loved him. And then, when Santa Anna became president in 1834, he had a change of heart. As soon as he became president and was firmly established in power, he realized, nah, I was wrong about that whole federalism thing, and he will get rid of the Constitution, get rid of the federal system, and centralize the country's power in him, and abolish all the states and make himself dictator. So now, Texas has been wanting to become an independent state. Well, now there are no states. There's only military districts, and Santa Anna is dictator. Now, there were other places in Mexico that actually made noise and complained about this and said, no, we are not going to accept it. So there are Mexican citizens that in other areas that complained and tried to resist this, and Santa Anna brutally slaughtered them. So he brutally slaughtered his own people to stay a dictator. It's what dictators do. So it was very obvious the citizens of Texas, Texans, they were not going to be treated better. So Texans made it very clear that they were not going to accept the centralization of the country, which led to the Battle of Gonzales. It's called the Lexington of Texas, like Lexington and Concord. The city of Gonzales had been lent a cannon by the Mexican military in order to protect them from Comanches. Now, when the people of Texas said, no, we're not going to accept the centralized government, Mexican troops were sent to go retrieve that cannon. And that's when the people of Gonzales will make the flag that you see about 5 times on bumper stickers if you get in your car for any extent period of time. And they will go to try to get it. Now, the Battle of Gonzales was not militarily significant whatsoever. Make a very long story, or to make it, this is not too much of an exaggeration to say Mexican forces got there. Texans were like, no, we're not going to give it to you. And then they fired the cannon at them and then ran at them wildly. And the Mexican forces, soldiers just kind of like looked at each other and said, hey, we're just supposed to get a cannon, not fight. Do we want to get into battle? And they're all like, nah, not really. Let's go. And so then they rode away. It was not militarily significant whatsoever. The casualty count were 2 Mexican soldiers died, and 1 Texian got a bloody nose because when he was charging, he got so excited he fell off his horse and smashed his face. So it was not militarily significant whatsoever, but it marked a clear break between the colonists and the Mexican government, and is considered the start of the Texas Revolution. Just for fun, if you have ever been to see the cannon, that is it, or at least a replica of it. So whenever you see that bumper sticker, just know that it is based on the actual size of the cannon itself. I love this picture because you know the guy that's smiling is smiling because he has a bigger gun in his car than this cannon. The cannons, they were incredibly ineffective. Mexican artillery was just terrible. Mostly what it did is make a loud boom sound, which would sometimes scare off the Native Americans. But yeah, it's super, super unimpressive cannon. Now, in response to the Battle of Gonzales, Santa Anna will round up a force of 6,000 Mexican troops and come to Texas with the intent of killing all rebelling Anglos, all rebelling Texans. So he comes with the intent of making an example of the people there. And on March 2nd, so in response to this huge Mexican force coming up, on March 2nd, 1836, the government, it was a very, I'm using government very loosely. The government that was created by the Texians declared independence for themselves. At the same time they were declaring independence is when Santa Anna and his force 6,000 were killing a bunch of Texians at the Alamo. Now, the Alamo made it very clear that Santa Anna, he was not joking around. He was there to kill. I mean, even at the Alamo, and we have accounts from officers of the Mexican military, there were a bunch of people from the Alamo that tried to surrender, and he just would not accept it. He was like, no, kill them. And even some of the generals were like, that's kind of mean. But he was there to slaughter. So it was very clear that the Texians, this was very serious. And so after the Alamo, Santa Anna will then go after the Texian army. Now, fortunately for Texas, the Texian army was led by Sam Houston. And I wish I had more time to talk about Sam Houston. He's incredibly impressive in all sorts of ways. He's the general of the Texian forces. And he develops a strategy a lot like George Washington. Run away. Even at his time, he was criticized harshly, like, well, why aren't you fighting? And he had to actually tell people, I have 600 people, people left all the time, 600 to 800 people. He has 6,000. That's why I am not fighting. So Sam Houston will lead a strategic retreat across Texas. And just so we're clear, if you get into the details of the Texas Revolution, it is so incredibly unimpressive, the battles. I mean, it's like, who can do a worse job? And like, there are very few high notes and highlights, and Sam Houston, he is absolutely the high note of the war. Even his own officers were like, no, we need to stop and fight. And he kept telling people, like, look, the numbers, we don't have enough people. And so he kept retreating until Santa Anna made a mistake. That's what he had been waiting for. Santa Anna made a huge mistake by splitting up his military into two. Santa Anna had this idea, we're going to surround them. So he split his military up into two. There's a bigger force and there's a smaller force. And this is just the break that Houston had been waiting for. So he took advantage of it, and when he will lead his military and attack the smaller of the forces. April of 1836, Battle of San Jacinto, U.S. forces, or Texian forces, will just completely annihilate the Mexican forces there. The Mexican army was just absolutely obliterated. And when I say obliterated, you definitely don't have to know the numbers, but the casualty count. Mexicans had 600 killed, 200 wounded, and 700 captured. That is a casualty rate of 1,500. Texians, 3 killed, 30 wounded. So 1,500 to 33. So that is a doozy. The fighting was over in like minutes. And you will hear and you will read a lot of places saying that the Mexican forces were taking a nap, and that is not accurate. The problem was these are all they're not even Mexican army is not even volunteers. Santa Anna, when he was going up to Mexico, like you'd stop by farms and just be like, hey, you're in the army now, come on. And so he's just like taking people off of their farm and saying, no, you're now in the military, we're going to go kill us some Anglos. And they didn't want to be there. They had no interest in the fighting. They had no skin in the game, so to speak. So their Mexican forces, they surrender almost immediately. Most of the battle was Houston riding around, telling his men to stop killing so many people. That's why there were 600 casualties, because Texans were just yelling, remember the Alamo, it was just a bloodbath. So 3 killed, 30 wounded on the Texian side. One of the wounded was Houston. But, and this is the kicker, they noticed that one of the Mexican soldiers, all the other Mexican soldiers kept saluting. And lo and behold, they had captured Santa Anna. Santa Anna had actually put himself with the smaller military. And he had changed clothes to put on like regular civilian clothing and tried to make it look like he was not the president, tried to blend in. Unfortunately, his soldiers were trained. You have to salute, otherwise, terrible things happen. So they all kept saluting him. So they caught Santa Anna. That's why the Battle of San Jacinto, it is the most important battle of the Texas Revolution. Santa Anna, he will not beg for his life, but he agreed to sign a treaty, the Treaty of Velasco. Treaties of Velasco, don't worry about that. Treaty of Velasco does two things. It recognized Texas independence, and it guaranteed Santa Anna's life. So the Battle of San Jacinto, it is the end of the Texas Revolution. And Texas was then an independent nation according to Texans. Now, later on, Mexico will insist that Mexico will insist that it did not count, they didn't ratify it, and Santa Anna did not have the right to do that. So the Mexican government will insist that the Treaty of Velasco is not valid. And even Santa Anna later on will say that it was forced under coercion, so it's not valid. It's kind of interesting. Like Sam Houston had the most difficult time just keeping Santa Anna alive, because Texians were like, let's kill him. Hey, we got Santa Anna, let's kill him. And he had to keep saying, like, no, he's not useful to us dead. He's useful to us alive. So Sam Houston, in order just to make sure keep Santa Anna alive, he actually sends him to America. And he was exiled to Cuba, but he sent him to America first, and Santa Anna met with Andrew Jackson, and turns out they got along really well. People with dictatorial tendencies always tend to get along. So That is the end of the Texas Revolution.